The phenomenological approach is an approach to personality that was created by Abraham Maslow back in the 1950s. In fact, Abraham Maslow's primary model of the phenomenological approach of personality was represented here by the hierarchy of needs, which is probably a topic you've heard of, although you very unlikely have heard much in the way of the details of the hierarchy of needs. The hierarchy of needs was created when Maslow, living at a time when Sigmund Freud was very popular, fell on the side of many other Americans in which he did not like Freud's theories. In fact, even to this day, Freud is a little bit more popular in Europe than he is in North America. Although he was quite popular here in the United States, there was always, even right from the beginning, a substantial minority of scientists that believed that Freud had extended himself way beyond the scientific credibility and was making up too many obtuse, overly theoretical suggestions of little value. Maslow counted himself in that group. And in fact, to specifically counter Freud's work, Maslow decided that he would create a theory of personality to contrast Freud's that was created in the opposite way that Freud made his. So Freud created his theory of personality by working with a small number of people that had a mental illness. Maslow decided that he would work with a large group of people with no obvious mental illness. So Maslow did nothing more than interview about 500 people and ask them what they wanted out of life. And through the interview process, he should have made a histogram, just essentially a basic bar graph showing what was the most common response people said, and then along down the line to the smallest number of things. Maslow got cute with his bar graph, and he rotated it 90 degrees and turned it into a pyramid. And that's where the hierarchy of needs as a pyramid came from. This hierarchy is nothing more than a histogram turned on its side. What it really represents is, for the people that he interviewed, what characteristics of life are they most concerned with if they had to give other things up? And going through a series of questions like that, essentially saying, if you could have money or your health, what would be more important? People might say health, and say, okay, if you had to damage one of your limbs, would it be your left arm, left leg, right leg? Questions sort of like that. Those are not specific examples from his survey, but those are really the way in which the questioning took place. What do you feel is most important that you would wind up keeping? And in this scenario, physiological needs at the very bottom of the pyramid is really the thing that most people are concerned with. That's basically their physical health. After that, it's issues of safety. So generally when people have their medical health, they start focusing on issues of safety. When they have their medical health and safety, then they begin focusing on relationships, belongingness, and love needs. That's essentially issues of relationships, connecting with other people. Now, once they are satisfied with the number of relationships they have, according to Maslow's single survey that he did in the 1950s, people tend to focus on how they feel about themselves. And Maslow referred to that as esteem needs. Now, when you talk about esteem needs for yourself, it's called self-esteem. And this is exactly in this 1953 article where self-esteem was actually born. You can find the term self-esteem going back much further in the field of psychology, but it's not defined in the way similar to the way that you would understand it currently until this particular article. So essentially the self-esteem that you're kind of aware of today is created in this particular article. And after a person has sufficient self-esteem, then they move on to self-actualization. And the concept of self-actualization, as it is usually presented on television, on talk shows, for example, the concept of self-actualization always is presented in a manner like it's a Western cultural version of a nirvana experience. That when you reach the top of the pyramid, you suddenly have this realization that all things are connected and that everything you do affects everything else. And so you start making decisions about, becoming a vegan so you don't hurt animals, and driving an electric car, or only using your bicycle, and meditating for an hour a day, and always making sure you do random acts of kindness. These are always the kind of the general category of things that go along with self-actualization on a talk show. Unfortunately, that concept of self-actualization is not true at all. If you go into the original article written by Maslow, self-actualization is an extension of esteem needs. Esteem needs is when you're concerned with how you feel about yourself. And there's going to be more details in there about how a person feels about themselves in relation to how they're making their life goals. And we'll be talking about that in a little bit. Once you have met your life goals, you are in the realm of self-actualization. And what you do when you reach self-actualization is you begin spending your time trying to see how far in life you can go. So it's not a Western nirvana experience where you realize you're one part of a larger network of things and that you have to send out good vibes to make everybody else happy. Really, what self-actualization is about is a completely inward-looking, entirely selfish version of how far you can go in life. And so if you have your medical health, you're safe, you've got friendships, you feel good about yourself, the next question is, what am I going to do before I die? And you make a bucket list and you start crossing things off. You never went jet skiing, go jet skiing. You never went to the Grand Canyon, go there. You want to go to Italy, go to Italy. You want to travel around the world on a boat, well then travel around the world on a boat. But all these things are really all about you. What about you? You. It's a completely self-centered version of your psychological makeup. It's a time during which you spend all your time trying to see how far in life you can go, not how much you can help other people. And I say that specifically because that's the way it's presented on television. That is completely wrong. It is not a selfless process in which you try to engage society and make the world a better place. It's all about, what are you going to do before you die? And so if you've never climbed Mount Everest, go climb Mount Everest. Try walking from the southern tip of Argentina all the way up to Canada. Something you need to do. If you want to do it, then go ahead and do it. Put it on a list and start checking them off. And that's what self-actualization actually is. It's consistently presented incorrectly. It always makes you wonder, if things are so incorrectly presented on television, either the journalists simply don't check facts to see what self-actualization actually is, or they really do have a separate agenda that self-esteem and self-actualization have always been presented in a particular way, and a journalist needs to make a point about something, so they simply take this out and throw it into their article or their television program because people just believe it as it's actually presented. But it is very different. The concept of self-esteem and self-actualization are actually very different concepts than the way that they're presented on talk shows. To highlight just how different self-esteem is in the common way in which people think about it, which is the media version of self-esteem, from what self-esteem actually is. I'm going to show you this movie.
Things are different in classrooms these days. Now when kids sing about heroes, they're not thinking about Abe Lincoln. They're singing about themselves.
Can you tell us what a warm fuzzy is?
Time once spent on reading and writing now goes to things like giving warm fuzzies, also known as compliments.
I like your hair.
Me.
Just one of many activities designed to make kids feel special.
I'm one of a kind.
If not conceited.
Today I'm selling a super duper fabulous fantastic thing. Me.
It's called the self-esteem movement.
I have a lot of talent.
It's based on the premise that since successful people seem to have high self-esteem, then if we teach self-esteem, we'll get successful people. That would be reasonable
I'm happy to be me.
if it worked. But even after doing this for more than 20 years,
We are happy. You are you.
no one's been able to prove that it does work. And they've tried. California spent 3 years and $750,000 on the task force to promote self-esteem. But this study they initiated failed to show that self-esteem courses led to achievement. Perhaps the most unexpected bad news about the self-esteem movement is that some experts say it may actually be dangerous. For years we've been told that kids in trouble suffer from low self-esteem. It's a concept used to try to make sense of the horrible school shooting sprees of the past year. But new research suggests the self-esteem advocates have it backwards. Violence may be the result of artificially high self-esteem.
People who have this inflated, grandiose view of themselves, when other people criticize them, they're likely to lash out and become angry and aggressive.
Psychology professors Brad Bushman and Roy Baumeister did research on over 1,000 undergraduates and found that people who thought they were superior or who had inflated views of themselves were more aggressive. We asked them to show us the study. Bushman and Baumeister gave students a standardized questionnaire that asked true or false questions like, if I ruled the world, it would be a better place. This man scored in the 98th percentile. He has a very high opinion of himself. Then each student was asked to write a short essay and told an unidentified partner would judge it.
This envelope contains your essay.
In truth, there were no partners, but students like him were told, this is the worst essay I've ever seen. Next, they were given a chance to torture the phantom partner who'd criticized them. They were told if they could press a button faster than their opponent, they could blast them with noise. It turned out that students like this man, the students with inflated self-esteem, were 3 times more aggressive, much more likely to try to blast the other guy's eardrum.
Conceited people get nasty when you burst their bubble of self-love.
Consider violent prisoners. Conventional wisdom says convicts have low self-esteem, and maybe they're violent because they don't like themselves. But we went to this prison and gave 65 criminals the self-esteem test. It turned out that as a group, these guys feel much better about themselves than college students who took the same test.
Self-esteem.
Now, we're not saying that self-esteem classes lead to violence, but the claim that the classes reduce violence is dubious. Yet the schools don't seem to hear that, even though lately more critics are speaking out. The head of the American Psychological Association now says promoting baseless self-esteem is dangerous.
Based on what we just saw in that video, let's take a look at this question. Here's a quote that I found from a website some time ago from Oprah Winfrey. Self-esteem comes from being able to define the world in your own terms and refusing to abide by the judgments of others. With what you just saw in the previous video, do you think the definition of self-esteem that talk show hosts use, like the one from Oprah above, is the same one the psychologists use? And as you might imagine, the answer is no. No, they are not. In fact, they are completely different. As we're going to see in the next slide, we'll start to talk about the actual definition of self-esteem. The concept of self-esteem that's actually used on talk shows generally, of this one being a very prototypical one from Oprah, is really kind of a positive outlook on life. There's nothing wrong with having a positive outlook on life. It's just that the concept of self-esteem that's being used on the talk shows is not the definition of self-esteem from when it was created in this 1953 article by Abraham Maslow. The quote from Oprah is, "Self-esteem comes from being able to define the world in your own terms and refusing to abide by the judgments of others." If you watch Oprah or other types of talk shows like this that always have in the end some positive message for the audience, basically what's actually happening is the talk show host or hostess is simply your personal cheerleader. They're always telling you, go out there in the world and be successful. You can do it. And don't let other people hold you back. And you'll be successful if you keep your eyes on the prize and focus, keep your nose to the grindstone, or use any other cliche that you want. But if you just work and focus on yourself, then you'll wind up being successful. And that idea is okay in general. I mean, it's not really science one way or the other. It's just kind of a comment that you make to get people jazzed up to try harder so that they'll make their goals. But it has absolutely nothing to do with self-esteem. Self-esteem is really all about whether or not you made your goals. You reached the goals that you set in your life. So how was the phenomenological approach created? Well, Maslow interviewed healthy subjects, that is, people that did not clearly have any component of mental illness, not known to have any particular psychological disorder, and he used this approach specifically because he wanted to contrast it against Freud's work, where Freud created a developmental model of personality based on a small number of unhealthy subjects. Now, Maslow's survey, even though it has 500 people included in it, is nothing more than the descriptive approach. Hopefully you remember from chapter 1, the descriptive approach plays out in terms of naturalistic observation, case studies, and surveys. And this is a survey. It doesn't control any variables in the environment. It doesn't even try to correlate with a Pearson correlation coefficient the characteristics of individuals and patterns of their behavior. He simply is asking a person on one particular day what they would give up, what they thought was most important, and filtered that through to see how people would answer. Maslow's work is a scientific study, but of the lowest degree possible. It is a survey. It does nothing to control variables. It only asks a person's opinion on one given day. And for all we know, 24 hours later, back in 1953, all 500 of his subjects could have answered differently. We don't know. There's no follow-up. In fact, when you take a look at Maslow's work, he really doesn't do much work on this model after he comes out with this hierarchy of needs. In fact, the hierarchy of needs comes out in 53. I believe he publishes maybe 2 or 3 more times during the decade. The hierarchy of needs is not well known. It doesn't have much value. It's simply a low-grade theoretical argument against Freud, and it's not really referenced much or applied much at all. What ultimately happens that leads to the point where you are familiar with the hierarchy of needs is that in the early 60s, the talk shows and television programs and television news and so forth during the Vietnam War started to pick up generally on what you would refer to as political correctness today. The news programs would focus on marches by hippies and how people were always complaining that society and the rich and the middle age and people with money were always controlling things and making a mess of society for everybody else. And all of this probably sounds very typical to you today because it's the same basic story from the media that plays out today, but in a slightly different way. But it was in the 60s where this idea that the media would start to use this blaming process for people in society. And probably because it was about the first time that this actually took place, people actually started to believe it. And this is where the phenomenological approach comes in, because people started to go to therapy to simply become a better individual. That is, they were hearing so frequently on talk shows and television networks and so forth, through movies and so forth, that they were responsible for all the problems in society, that there was a Vietnam War going on and soldiers were killing babies and all the other bad things that people used to say back then. And people started to feel bad. So they would just go to therapy because they wanted to be a better person, right? They didn't necessarily see that they had a real significant psychological problem. They just wanted to go to a therapist and figure out how to be a better person. And what happened was that psychologists were flooded with people coming in trying to become a better individual. And that's where you really start to see an expression of group therapy. Because a therapist could, for example, charge you $50 an hour, and that would be the only amount of money he gets. Or he could have 10 people come in for $10 a piece. If everybody was charged $10 an hour, then he would make twice as much money, and you could do less work because all you had to do is sit people around in a giant circle and have them talk about their feelings. And this sounds very much like group therapy that you would probably recognize today. And group therapy does have significant value under certain circumstances. So don't believe that I'm telling you group therapy is of no value. Group therapy existed before the time of Maslow, before the 1960s, but it was really activated by therapists as a way to engage all the people that were trying to come in to just become better individuals. And so therapists made more money. They also handled the greater demand of people coming in for therapy. And the therapist had to use a psychological treatment approach that made sense with people that wanted to become better individuals. And one of those approaches was Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The idea that you could rise up through the hierarchy to become self-actualized was a concept that was being told to the patients of the time. And so they were working toward rising up through the hierarchy to stay healthy, right? The lowest rung, stay healthy, become safe, engage with other people, develop friendships, develop more self-esteem, and eventually become self-actualized. And this concept becomes a core component of applied psychology during the 1960s into the 1970s. During the 70s, probably around by 1975 or so, this whole concept starts to wane and die off. But it is so popular during that time that the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and a variety of other theories like Est that you don't hear about anymore are very popular concepts that people are aware of at that time in the 60s and 70s. They are used on talk shows all the time as the basis for understanding human behavior. And so as the self-improvement phase starts to die out in the 70s, and the talk shows are using these concepts to talk about human behavior, the talk shows start twisting the ideas for their own entertainment purposes on television And by the time the 80s and 90s roll around, the concept of self-esteem is the one that you saw today, or that you see today, that you saw in the movie that we just watched, which is self-esteem is about how you feel you know best. The current view of self-esteem in the media is about how much you like yourself. And if you like yourself, the idea is that you will then like other people. If you want to take care of yourself, then you'll take care of other people. If you don't like yourself, then you won't take care of other people. So as you saw in the video, prisoners maybe theoretically from this media version of self-esteem probably don't like themselves, and that's why they do bad things to other people. That idea turns out not to be true. This is simply a process that's presented to you in the media that is a corruption of the original phenomenological approach by Abraham Maslow. The approach was corrupted over the course of decades of entertainment use on talk shows and in plot lines in Hollywood movies and in books and novels and so forth, where you try to create a psychological profile for a victim or a detective or a serial killer, and you use this idea over and over again so that it is just presented this way incorrectly. And I think in a lot of ways, either the people that use it now this way simply do believe it because it just seems so common and they don't bother checking the facts. But I don't believe anyone from a talk show is actually checking their facts regarding what self-esteem is, because it's completely different than anything that you would actually see on television. Out of this whole phenomenological approach, one of the things that you see that actually does develop somewhat usefully overall for the field of clinical psychology comes from the work of Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers spent his career essentially doing experimental clinical work. That is, Carl Rogers would create a therapeutic approach, and then he would use it in specific ways with particular types of clients. So, for example, he'd create a model to treat people with anxiety or depression. And he would use it, evaluate it scientifically, see what works, see what didn't work, adjust his model, and then go back in with a new model and continue adjusting how he conducted therapy over the course of his career. And that's a very straightforward scientific process. Do something, collect data, change how you do it again, and so forth. And there shouldn't be any big surprise that an approach like this is going to start paying off over time. And that's exactly what you see with Carl Rogers. Despite the fact that Maslow made this article, didn't really publish on it much after that, passed away nearly a decade later. Obviously, he's not contributing much to the advancement of it. Rogers kind of takes the baton and is the primary person that brings the idea of the phenomenological approach into the future. Now, keep this in mind. Rogers' work is being done scientifically, and that is happening concurrently with the increasingly media version of the phenomenological approach that people use on talk shows. So, although science may progress unabated in a laboratory somewhere, television is taking the idea and corrupting it over time. Now, what is it that Carl Rogers actually does that makes it that makes a phenomenological approach useful? Well, his approach really leads to the development of the three concepts that you see there on the bottom of the screen: the concepts of genuineness, acceptance, and empathy. And these are three approaches that are very key to keeping a client in therapy and engaging the therapeutic process in an active sense, so that they are more likely to develop positive outcomes from therapy, as opposed to not really engaging the therapy or even just falling out. Now, what do they mean? Genuineness refers to the idea that the patient sees the therapist as somebody who actually cares about them. Now, does the therapist truly care about the patient? Well, probably in many cases they do. Some cases they might not. And if they don't, they need to play the role that they do. They need to make sure that the patient believes that it appears that they are very concerned about their success. Now, this is important because consider what would happen if you didn't have genuineness. If the patient does not believe that the therapist actually cares about their improvement, would the patient come back to therapy? All right. Psychological therapy tends to be fairly expensive. Even today, it's easily $150 per hour, and that's maybe even on the low end. So if you're going to put out that much money for therapy and the therapist you're working with doesn't really care whether or not you improve, you're probably not going to go back to therapy. And that's just the issue. That is exactly the point. If you drop out of therapy, then you're not going to improve. So having a therapist express genuineness will keep the patient in therapy and actively engaged. Next, acceptance. Acceptance is also more commonly known as unconditional positive regard. And unconditional positive regard or unconditional love, which is the more general term that gets used, really just simply says that the therapist will simply accept whatever the patient says, no matter how horrible it is. So, for example, I once had a professor in a clinical course tell us about an individual that he worked with who was in court-appointed therapy because the guy lived for the weekend when he would go out to bars, get drunk, and start fights. And that was this guy's most fun thing in the whole world, is to get a bunch of beers in him and then just start a random fight in the bar and have a brawl. And this person who would talk very enthusiastically about who he punched in the face and how many fights he got in, and when the police showed up, whether or not he tried to grab at the cop's gun or anything like this. Obviously, very socially inappropriate behavior, to say the least. But as a therapist, you can't sit there and tell the person, dude, you're being an idiot, which is something like your friends might say. You have to listen to this and just accept what the person says. It has to be a place where the patient feels comfortable to express themselves without being judged. If you don't do this, then the patient will hold back on what they say, and you as the therapist will not be able to help them. Because if the patient is not comfortable to express the darkest, most troubling thoughts in their head, how could you ever actually deal with the problem that they have? You can't, because they're hiding it. And when they hide it, then if the patient is hiding their thoughts, then therapy will not progress. And so it's much better to have this aspect of acceptance or unconditional positive regard. Another version of that, which you hear commonly used today, is the idea of a safe space, a place where you can go and express yourself in an honest fashion so that you can be who you are. And that would be a safe space. And the concept of safe space is just an outgrowth of Carl Rogers' entire career of doing clinical work, in which he showed the genuineness, acceptance, and empathy are actually significantly important for therapeutic processes to take place. And the last one, empathy. Empathy is very important because in therapy, a patient may tell you uncomfortable, inappropriate things. Try to imagine if a therapist is working with a convicted pedophile, and the pedophile still has an interest in children. If that person expresses those thoughts in therapy, the therapist cannot make faces and turn away and say, "Dude, that's sick." That again, you're undermining the progress of therapy in this case. Empathy is when a patient expresses their thoughts, maybe possibly of a really socially inappropriate manner, like they like to get into bar fights, that they're a convicted pedophile and they still have interest in children, that it's an abusive spouse that enjoys abusing their children. Those types of things have to be met with empathy. You don't want to be judgmental about these things, because when you're judgmental to a patient in therapy, progress in therapy will slow to a crawl. What you want to do, what is actually much more advantageous for the process of therapy itself, is to express empathy. So listen to the person and let them say whatever they want to say. That's acceptance. And then reflect it back to them so that they know you understand what they were actually saying in an empathetic fashion. So you can say, "I understand that you really like getting into bar fights. I understand that you really do enjoy punching people, but I also know that you're trying to change that pattern of behavior, and I'm here to help you do that." That would be an empathetic statement. And that would be a much more effective way to progress through this process of therapy. And in a case like this, when you have genuineness, acceptance, and empathy applied, you are much more likely to see improvements in therapy. And in a case like this, we'll see how it gets applied in this particular movie.
Like Virginia, I too found nothing gave me pleasure. I thought only of my health, death, and the certainty that I was going mad. So what was happening to my mind? To find out, I've come to Philadelphia to meet Aaron Beck.
Oh, it's so good to see you.
Dr. Beck has been a pioneering figure in the treatment of depressives for 40 years.
I just feel like I'm failing in every way. As a wife and as a mother and as a human being and better. I guess nobody can do that.
Well, let's see what we can do, and perhaps you yourself can take the lead in solving some of these problems.
Beck was amongst the first to recognize that in depression, thought processes become distorted.
As I listened to my patients, I noticed a very interesting thing. They seem to observe everything and interpret everything through blue-tinted glasses. So if something really good happened, they would tend to dismiss it as nothing. If something neutral happened, then they saw the bad parts of it. And if something unpleasant happened, then they saw it in very exaggerated terms.
One of these days, he's just going to come home and say, "Marsha, I'm leaving you. I met somebody else. And I don't want to be with you and the children anymore." And then I just...
All right, so what you're doing is you're building up a whole scenario, aren't you? When the phone rings and your husband doesn't come home, you have a whole story cooked up in your head.
What Dr. Beck discovered was that his patient's distorted sense of reality was caused by a stream of negative thoughts of which they were largely unaware.
Oh, why should he want to come home to me, and I'm a bad mother and a bad housewife and so on?
The depressed person has negative thoughts all the time right in the periphery of his mind. And it's these depressed thoughts that affect his mood and affect his behavior and affect his feelings about other people. The result of this is that the negative thoughts go around in a vicious cycle. And the more negative thoughts the person has, the more sad he feels. The more sad he feels, the more negative thoughts he has. And it just goes around and around like that.
The concept of a cycle, or a vicious cycle, if you want, in psychological therapy is actually very common. In fact, this cycle that Aaron Beck was talking about in terms of depression is actually something we'll be working with when we get to the psychological disorders chapter, because we will see the same idea show up in anxiety and depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. That is, cycles of thinking patterns that occur. The concept of self-esteem originally did not have a specific scale or some type of measurement device for it. And in fact, the early measures for it were actually very, very general. Carl Rogers came up with a process in which he would ask the patients 2 questions: what they wish they were, and what are they now? That is, what is their goals in life, and where are they at now? And that would be a measure. The difference between those 2 things would be a measure of their self-esteem. So, for example, if you said, what do you wish you were? And you said, well, I wish I was a pediatrician working at a university hospital. And you say, well, what are you now? And you say, well, I'm actually a pediatrician working at a university hospital. Because my goal in life is actually where I'm at now, I would be said to be a person with high self-esteem. A person with low self-esteem would have a large difference between their goal and where they're at now. So where do you wish you were? Well, I want to be a pediatrician at a university hospital. And where are you now? Well, I'm a first semester undergraduate working on a bachelor's degree. I haven't even picked my major yet. Okay, well, if all goes well and you get your bachelor's degree in 4 years, and then you do 4 years of medical school, and then maybe 3 years of a residency, that's 4 plus 4 plus 3. That's going to be 11 years from making your goals. And that person, because they are far from reaching their goal, 11 years, would be said to have low self-esteem. Now, this is the way self-esteem was evaluated from the original phenomenological approach. This is Rogers' version of the way to assess the degree of self-esteem that a person had. And keep this in mind. Self-esteem is all about how close you are to making your goals. Because remember, when you finally meet your goals and you have high self-esteem, you go to the top level of the pyramid, which is self-actualization. You've met all your goals in life. Now you're just going to come up with new things to do to see how far you can go in life. Okay? If we back it back down to the esteem needs aspect, there was no good measure originally for how to do it, so it was just done in 2 general questions: what they wish they were, or what's your goal in life, and where are you now? That is completely different than the concept of self-esteem that's presented on television. The concept of self-esteem that's presented on television is all about whether or not you like yourself. Liking yourself has absolutely nothing to do with self-esteem from the phenomenological approach. It was never a thing that Abraham Maslow ever discussed. The idea that you have to like yourself before you can go do things for other people or be nice to other people is a completely made up idea from the media. But it's been repeated so often that people just treat it as though it's fact, despite the fact that there is no basis for it. And this is a very important point that you need to grasp, because you saw that even in the video of the prisoners in the video that we had seen. The prisoners tend to actually think very highly of themselves. When they feel highly of themselves, they don't mind imposing themselves on other people because they feel they know best. When you feel you know best, you're more likely to impose your opinions on other people and tell them how they live their life. For a person that is more open, that they feel maybe they have a way that they're comfortable with living, and other people should just be able to decide for themselves how they should live, but nobody should tell anybody else how to live their life, that's an individual that's not going to impose themselves on other individuals. It doesn't lead to conflict. And so what you wind up seeing is individuals that are very certain that they know best are usually the ones that actually have high self-esteem. And those individuals are more likely to engage in confrontations with other individuals because they simply feel that they know better than the other person and that the other people should do things as they say. So let's look at a couple of questions related to this whole topic. Which phenomenological researcher developed the clinical therapy? Well, the answer there is Rogers, and only Rogers. Maslow never created a therapeutic process or a clinical therapy. Maslow simply used the descriptive approach by engaging a survey with 500 people, wrote up a model, and keep this in mind, the broader story, Maslow only did this to make something to contrast with Sigmund Freud because Maslow did not like Freud's work. Next question. Which of the following problems do you think might be effectively treated with Rogerian therapy? Okay, well, Rogerian therapy. Rogerian therapy is a specific type of the phenomenological approach, right? Carl Rogers makes a way to apply the phenomenological approach in a therapeutic process. What kinds of things is Rogers treating? D, personal improvement. That's the primary thing. The others there are all really just too difficult. And frankly, it gets a little bit ahead in terms of semester. But schizophrenia and bipolar affective disorder have a very strong underlying biological process that no amount of talk therapy is going to be able to change. Suicidal ideation. If a person is thinking about committing suicide, it's too late to talk to them about their life goals. Okay, and I know that sounds really silly, but that's absolutely the case. If a person's going to commit suicide, you need to focus on keeping that individual safe at that time. Later on, when they're safe, you could talk to them about how they think about their life and so forth.